As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I have a few questions for my colleagues. What if our foreign policy of the past century is deeply flawed and has not served our national security interests? What if we wake up one day and realize that the terrorist threat is a predictable consequence of our meddling in the affairs of others and has nothing to do with us being free and prosperous? What if propping up repressive regimes in the Middle East endangers both the United States and Israel? What if occupying countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and bombing Pakistan is directly related to the hatred directed toward us? What if someday it dawns on us that losing over 5,000 American military personnel in the Middle East since 9/11 is not a fair trade-off for the loss of nearly 3,000 American citizens, no matter how many Iraqi, Pakistani, and Afghan people are killed or displaced? What if we finally decide that torture, even if called enhanced interrogation technique, is self-destructive and produces no useful information, and that contracting it out to a third world nation is just as evil? What if it is finally realized that war and military spending is always destructive to the economy? What if all wartime spending is paid for through the deceitful and evil process of inflating and borrowing? What if we finally see that wartime conditions always undermine personal liberty? What if conservatives who preach small government wake up and realize that our interventionist foreign policy provides the greatest incentive to expand the government? What if conservatives understood once again that their only logical position is to reject military intervention and managing an empire throughout the world? What if the American people woke up and understood that the official reasons for going to war are almost always based on lies and promoted by war propaganda in order to serve special interests? What if we as a nation came to realize that the quest for empire eventually destroys all great nations? What if Obama has no intention of leaving Iraq? What if a military draft is being planned for the wars that will spread if our foreign policy is not changed? What if the American people learn the truth, that our foreign policy has nothing to do with national security, that it never changes from one administration to the next? What if war and preparation for war is a racket serving the special interests? What if President Obama is completely wrong about Afghanistan and it turns out worse than Iraq and Vietnam put together? What if Christianity actually teaches peace and not preventive wars of aggression? What if diplomacy is found to be superior to bombs and bribes in protecting America? What happens if my concerns are completely unfounded? Nothing. But what happens if my concerns are justified and ignored? Nothing good. And I yield back the balance of my time.
So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Sunday doubled down on his vow to attack the southern Gaza Strip city of Rafah, despite growing criticism of the plan. So it's estimated that 1.5 million Palestinians are packed into Rafah, which has a pre-war population of 275,000. So think about that. 275,000 population. Now there's 1.5 million people sheltering there. And most of the people that are sheltering in the city are living on tents in the street, and many have been displaced multiple times since Israel unleashed its onslaught. On Friday, Netanyahu ordered the military to draw up an evacuation plan for Rafah, but it's unclear where the Palestinians sheltering there will go. A few hours after Netanyahu said that he ordered the plan, Israeli airstrikes hit residential buildings in Rafah, killing 28. Heavy Israeli airstrikes were also reported in Rafah late Sunday into Monday morning. So I saw this not too long before I started recording that it looked like Israel was really hitting Rafah really hard, at least with airstrikes. And according to the preliminary reports from Al Jazeera, at least 50 people have been killed so far. Aid groups are warning that a full-scale Israeli assault on Rafah would be a bloodbath due to the concentration of Palestinians. Egypt, which borders Rafah, is reportedly threatening to scrap its 1979 peace treaty with Israel if it attacks the city. And, of course, Egypt strongly opposes anything that could lead to an influx of Palestinian refugees entering its territory. We know where Netanyahu really wants them to go, is into Egypt, but Egypt is not going to let that happen. Also on Sunday, President Biden spoke with Netanyahu and said that the U.S. would support an attack on Rafah if Israel had a plan to evacuate civilians. So the Biden administration has paid lip service to this idea. There's all these reports saying that, Biden's getting frustrated with the Israelis. The U.S. is warning them, don't do this without, unless you take account for the civilians. But we saw this all before when Israel was planning its attack on Khan Yunis, and we saw how brutal that was. And, none of the criticism or concern means anything because the U.S. continues to provide Israel with unconditional military aid, despite the massive civilian casualty rate. And the latest number from Gaza's health ministry puts the death toll in the Strip since October 7th at 28,176, and that includes around 12,000 children. So the Iraqi government said on Sunday that it had resumed talks with the U.S. on the future of the U.S. military presence in Iraq amid outrage over U.S. airstrikes in the country. So this is Iraqi military spokesman Yahya Rasool. He said, quote, "The Supreme Iraqi Military Commission resumed on Sunday its meetings with international coalition forces in Baghdad. Based on these meetings, a timetable will be formulated for a deliberate and gradual reduction leading to an end to the mission," end quote. The U.S. and Iraq began the talks on January 27th. I didn't realize that they were actually suspended after the January 28th drone attack that hit a secretive U.S. base in Jordan, killing 3 U.S. troops. Since then, the U.S. has bombed Iraq several times, targeting the Shia militias that it claims were responsible. And then the latest bombing was the drone strike in Baghdad that targeted a Kateb Hezbollah leader. And of course, Kateb Hezbollah and many of these Shia militias are actually part of Iraq's security forces. So many people in Iraq are not happy about this. And in the wake of this drone strike, over 100 members of Iraq's 329-seat parliament signed a petition demanding the expulsion of U.S. and other foreign forces. And Iraq's parliament has voted for the U.S. to leave before, back in January 2020, after the Soleimani drone strike, but the U.S. refused to leave. And there are 2,500 U.S. troops in the country today. So the U.S. has rejected Russian President Vladimir Putin's latest offer for negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, as the Biden administration has consistently discouraged diplomacy in the nearly 2 years since Russia launched its invasion. So Putin made this offer during his interview with Tucker Carlson. Putin said, quote, "We are willing to negotiate. You should tell the current Ukrainian leadership to stop and come to the negotiating table," end quote. And when he said you there, he's referring to the U.S. So in response, a spokesperson for the White House's National Security Council told the New York Times that the U.S. has no reason to believe Putin is being genuine. The spokesperson said, quote, "Both we and President Zelensky have said numerous times that we believe this war will end through negotiations. Despite Mr. Putin's words, we have seen no actions to indicate he is interested in ending this war. If he was, he would pull back his forces and stop his ceaseless attacks on Ukraine," end quote. So the latest rejection of diplomacy with Russia comes as it is clear Ukraine has no chance of defeating Russia on the battlefield, and Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are facing shortages of weapons and personnel. Describing the bleak situation, a Ukrainian battalion commander on the front lines told the Washington Post, quote, "There is no positive outlook, absolutely none. It's going to end in a lot of death, a global failure," end quote. So the NSC spokesperson told the Times, quote, "Ultimately, it's up to Ukraine to decide its path on negotiations," end quote. So that old line that it's up to Ukraine to decide. Zelensky is still pushing his so-called peace formula, which has a plan to end the war, and that would include a full Russian withdrawal, Russia giving up Crimea, war crimes tribunals, and Russia paying reparations. So all non-starters as demands for talks with Russia. And Russia and Ukraine were engaged in peace talks in the early days of the invasion, but those negotiations were discouraged by the West. David Arakhamia, who's a member of Ukraine's parliament and led the Ukrainian delegation to Istanbul during peace talks with Russia in March 2022, he said in November that Russia only wanted a commitment of Ukrainian neutrality to end the war at the time. He said Ukraine didn't trust Russia, didn't want to sign a deal, but he also mentioned another reason why Ukraine didn't want to sign a deal, and he confirmed earlier reporting that said then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson told Zelensky that even if Ukraine was ready to sign a deal with Russia, Ukraine's Western backers were not. So he said, and this is confirming that reporting, again, this is Ukraine's top negotiator for the Istanbul talks in March 2022. He said, quote, "When we returned from Istanbul, Boris Johnson came to Kiev and said that we would not sign anything with them at all, and let's just fight," end quote. So here we are nearly 2 years later. and how many hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in this. And they still want to keep it going. No diplomacy. Nope. They want another $60 billion to fund the thing.
Here's how Thomas Jefferson put it. In cases of an abuse of the delegated powers, the members of the general government being chosen by the people, a change by the people would be the constitutional remedy. So Thomas Jefferson is telling us, well, if they're using the powers delegated to them and abusing them, using them in ways that you don't like, that you don't support, the constitutional remedy is vote the bums out. This is the Jeffersonian take, as long as they're within the bounds of the Constitution. But as soon as you get beyond that, which is constantly today, we're not in the situation where they are just within the bounds of the Constitution and doing bad policy. That is not even close to what we live under today. And so Jefferson gave us the answer. What is that enforcement? It would be nice if we had an enforcement mechanism, right? Well, Jefferson tells us, he said, but where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. It's not something to try after everything else fails. It's not something to kick down the line in case going to the government and begging the government to stop doing what the government was supposed to do. They don't follow what we suggest to them or demand or ask or beg. It's the rightful remedy every time they assume powers not delegated. He said every state has a natural right in cases not within the compact to nullify of their own authority all assumptions of power by others within their limits. And again, without this right, he said, they would be under the dominion, absolute and unlimited, of whosoever might exercise this right of judgment for them. So it's the same thing that Spooner was saying. If you let the government determine the powers given to itself, delegated to itself, it has unlimited power. Now, Hamilton, here's how he put it in Federalist number 28. He said, it may safely be received as an axiom in our political system that the state governments will in all possible contingencies afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority. So here's Alexander Hamilton telling us that the state governments, he's not as badass as some of the other people, but he's saying state governments are going to be the bulwark against federal power. Again, he's not saying you got to go to the federal government to stop the federal government from invading liberty. No, the state governments are the role. That's their role. If they take an oath to the Constitution, they are bound by oath to not only just not take actions in violation of the Constitution, but they're bound by oath to actively oppose any violations of the Constitution without being told by the violators or a branch of the organization that's violating the Constitution that they violated the Constitution. If you're waiting for the federal government to back down and say, oh yeah, well, we screwed up, our federal courts told us that we screwed up, then you're not actually opposing it. Again, you're just begging the federal government to change course. And even Hamilton is saying stuff like this, well, then it's definitely not just an outlier, because I'm showing you both ends of the spectrum here. He points out that they can at once adopt a regular plan of opposition in which they can combine all the resources of the community. They can readily communicate with each other in the different states and unite their common forces for the protection of their common liberty. That's Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 28, December 26, 1787. There's also Roger Sherman, who I cite pretty often here. He points out in December of 1787 that all acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void. I mentioned that earlier. All the founders agreed, left, right, and center, that anything that goes beyond the limits of the Constitution is void. It's just ultimately, how do you make it void in practice? Because a government that wants to violate the rules, even as Madison was talking about in Federalist 50, if they have decided that they're going to break through the chains, the rules given to them, just telling them that they're going to be censured 10, 20 years down the line, that's not going to stop them. Neither is a parchment barrier. None of this is going to stop them. But in law and under the Constitution, those acts are void. You have to do something to make them that way in practice. And Sherman gives us a pretty good hint. He says, nor could they be enforced contrary to the sense of a majority of the states. That means we know that Roger Sherman knew that when the federal government went beyond the limits of the Constitution, not only was it void, but they wouldn't care, and they would still try to enforce it. And as long as the states go along with it, and that means the states and the people themselves, then they're going to be able to enforce that. But if the states stand up and the people refuse to comply, then they can't enforce those things, especially when you have a majority of the states on board. Here's Theophilus Parsons in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, again, pointing out the same thing. What is the check on federal power? And he makes it very clear here. He said, but there is another check founded in the nature of the Union, superior to all the parchment checks that can be invented. So no matter what you put on paper, they only have so much impact. Of course, if it's really obvious that it says, well, we'd like to think shall not be infringed is pretty obvious. Unfortunately, to a lot of people, that what that means is not what it says. So that's, I guess, maybe a different discussion. But he's pointing out that no matter how good you may put rules on paper, there's something better than that as far as checking government power. He says if there should be a usurpation, it will not be on the farmer and merchant, employed and attentive only to their several occupations. He understood that most people, when they live their lives, they don't want to be focusing on having to resist a tyrannical power, a usurpation. acts against the Constitution, attacks on their liberty. They just want to be able to get by. And for many people, it's very difficult. And that's probably why I think the Federal Reserve is one of the number one things that really needs to be nullified into oblivion, because they destroy the purchasing power of that fiat funny money. They keep depreciating it by printing so much. And that means so many people have to work so much harder to do what previously they were able to do with much less work. And so this is a way that they actually work to put a population on its knees. But anyway, so people like to focus just on their day-to-day lives. And Parsons understood that. So he said it will be upon 13 legislatures, completely organized, possessed of the confidence of the people, and having the means as well as inclination successfully to oppose it. So Theophilus Parsons is also pointing out that states are a check, the ultimate check on federal power. Ultimately, just like Madison, just like Jefferson, Sherman, Alexander Hamilton. Now, some of them believe that it was the people of the states. Some people believe that it was state governments, but it's certainly none of them are saying that it's the federal government that is the final check on the power of the federal government. And Alexander Hamilton also in Federalist 28 points out that, well, if the people don't want to keep the feds in check, well, then you're going to be in big trouble, because if the people like what the federal government is doing or they're okay with it, they're not going to be demanding that their states do the right thing either. The states are going to be terrible. He said the obstacles to usurpation and the facilities of resistance increase with the increased extent of the state, provided the citizens understand their rights and are disposed to defend them. So if the people understand their rights and are disposed to defend them against all comers, then the whole system works well. But if the people are not aware of their rights, they don't like their rights, they hate their rights, they're just ignorant about them, or they're too afraid to defend them, then you don't have any check whatsoever.
So we haven't talked a lot about the CDC and the medical industrial complex very much. Partly for me because I don't want to remember it, but we saw this through our friends at Zero Hedge. The CDC is now retaliating against its own scientists for wronged masked research, and it's just a little bit of a chuckle. The CDC, the new director Mandy Cohen, kept evading questions on whether she would bring back the mask mandates last November, but it looks like the place is a mess still. Put on that next one if you can. Director Cohen's scientific bumbling continued last week as her agency began fighting with the CDC's own researchers over another contentious declaration. N95 respirators work better than surgical masks. And then it goes on, in recent years, mask advocates have shifted the goalposts, oh really, and demanded that you use the N95. They say they're better than surgical masks. I wonder if that's true even if you have like 5 or 6 masks, what some of those have. But anyway, it's just kind of funny, the CDC fighting the CDC because of science.
They quoted from a hearing back in November, and they had kept asking her, and she would evade questions on whether she would bring back mask mandate for toddlers. So the lack of an answer was an indication that stuff is alive and well, but they have to just clear the air. Make sure that, they do have a concern. We have to find somebody to blame, but the people are in charge. There's still a lot of them there because their goal is 100% to gain power, and lying with science is not a sin. It's a plus because they're good power brokers. They want to do good things when they want to have power, and they want to make sure everybody's taken care of. So that to me shows that with all of this, how bad this looks and how people are waking up, and it should be that don't let your guard down. I think they're still planning on all that stuff. The confusion on which masks to use. Should kids? She raised the whole question. And if there was anything ever more clear, but there were some recent articles where there was places that some country maybe it was, they were giving shots to kids less than 1 year of age. So that is pretty bad.
Congressional Dems warn of grim future for U.S. cyber agency under Trump. And so you can just see this very thoughtful director of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency. She's just trying to protect us, you can see in this photo. And the evil Trump is going to come and he's going to slash the budget of this agency that is so wonderful in protecting us so much. Well, if people have a bit of a memory, and they do, they will remember that the CISA, or Cybersecurity Agency, is the very agency uncovered in the Twitter files by Matt Taibbi and many over and over again as the government agency that coordinated with different NGOs and with Twitter and the other social media to censor and cancel people who said things like, the vax doesn't work, it's not 100%, don't take a mask, et cetera, et cetera. So they were not protecting our cybersecurity. They were basically shutting people up who said things they didn't like.
Over the last couple of years, we got to know that the FBI did the same thing. They would do the research and indicate it and report it to the government, and then the government would start the punishment. Oh no, they would allow the punishment to occur. But but now there are more people involved. So this is a big deal. I mean, if because it's so bad on the justice system.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that you can have somebody, FBI or another, observation group like the CISA, you know, to report to the government and coordinate this. This is so far removed from the concept of personal liberty.
And this is exactly like, this was recently, and I'll get to who signed this into law, but this is so reminiscent of the Department of Homeland Security, which is a battle that you remember very well when you were in the House. When everyone was so angry with you for voting against it, you don't want us to be secure? What's wrong with you? Why do you hate America? They're going to only go after the bad guys overseas. And now, of course, we know that they went after us, and they continue to go after us. They have lists of evil people who might be libertarians, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an example of it came into existence by saying, we got to protect against those evil Iranian hackers and Chinese hackers. The reality is we got to go against Americans who may be thinking for themselves. Well, here's from the Politico article, and here's how they lay their case out. While Trump's anger at CISA is well known, he may now have an opportunity to capitalize on a movement in his party to gut the agency. A number of GOP lawmakers and state attorneys general are alleging that the agency pressured Silicon Valley tech giants to censor conservative voices on their platforms during the 2020 election and COVID-19. Well, alleging is untrue. It's actually a fact, and we know this from the great reporting of Matt Taibbi and others at the Twitter files. We've seen the papers. We've seen all the receipts on this. Keep it up if you will, please. So we know that's a fact, and we know that the Silicon Valley giants were pushed by the government to censor. But the other thing that's wrong here is it's not censoring conservative voices. They always want to do this, Dr. Paul, make it left versus right. They were censoring anyone who was outside the very narrow window of what you can say and can't say. People on the left and the right, progressives and conservatives, and especially libertarians, were being shut up. It wasn't a left versus right thing.
You know, they don't use the term, but this is the battle over the First Amendment.
Yes.
On how you can close somebody down and cancel them, and it's rather sophisticated. But you know, they've had that one sentence in here that I think is fair to quote: Trump cannot unilaterally kill CISA, which the former president himself signed into law in 2018.
Exactly. Oh, that's the kicker.
So yes, you want your sympathies. Yeah, he's a little bit better than the other guy. We don't want to do that. But if he started this whole thing, and that's why some of our complaints had been on the foreign policy, that his speeches sometimes were better than his appointments.
Yeah.
You know, when he was in office. But you know, if he gets another chance, maybe there'll be some influence away from those ideas. There's a lot of collusion here. You have the collusion of the government agencies and also with the private companies. And it's back and forth. They're serving each other's interests. But then they come up with the sharpest criticism against those who are trying, honestly, to stop some of this. Oh, you're a fascist. You're a fascist doing this. And they're the ones who have this interventionism where you have corporatism and corporations are in there and they become an arm of the government. And it's worse. I mean, when I read and hear this now, it's worse than I ever dreamed of it, you know, that it could be. But I assume that there should be no surprises because it's out of control.
Yeah.